Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We are about to kick off our second panel of the day. This panel will be on the topic of design for R. So we've got our poll up here, and we'll leave that poll up for you all to answer. If you've joined us for any of our previous sessions today, these questions will look familiar. We are asking the same questions, but it is really great to give our panelists a sense of who's on the call and what you are looking to get out of today's session. So logistically, as people are getting settled in for this second panel, it's going to be run similarly to our previous panel. We're going to do a quick round of intros while we've got this poll still up, so you will know who our esteemed panelists are. And once those intros are over, we've got some great questions that you all have already asked when you signed up for today's session. We also will have open at the bottom of your screen, you can see there's both a chat feature and a Q&A. If you have questions, particularly if they come to mind as our panelists are talking, please put those in the Q&A module. And we'll leave the last 15 minutes or so for open questions from the audience. So feel free to throw those in at any time. The chat function, I think you can ask general logistics questions if you're having trouble hearing us or need points of clarification. We'll use that module for that. So as a reminder, my name is Kata Henning. I am Dragon Innovation's Director of Business Development. I am based in Seattle, Washington. We have 4 great panelists with us today to talk about design for R. Specifically, R, in our case, is going to be repair, reuse, and recycle. And so to kick things off, Dave, how about I pass it over to you?
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Dave Evans, co-founder and CEO of Fictive. We're based in sunny San Francisco, just one more poke at the Pacific Northwest, but we have teams globally. So we're a manufacturing ecosystem. We help connect companies that are building products to suppliers that have extra capacity and do it all in a digital form. Some sustainability and reliability is a big passion of mine. I'm a mechanical engineer by background, cut my teeth in automotive at Ford prior, and I love talking about this topic. So really excited to dive into design, manufacturing, and sustainability. So thanks for having me.
Great. Ryan, over to you.
Hello, my name is Ryan Vineyard. I'm an independent consultant with Vineyard Product Development. I help startups through early phase development, whereas Dragon figures out how to help people get stuff made. I figure out more what they want to make. My background, like Dave, also started in automotive. I was an electric vehicle engineer. My career has centered around sustainability achieved through hardware, clean air purifier, home water monitor, things like that. And I'm a big fan of making an impact with the hardware you're making, while also making an impact on the supply chain of your hardware. So really excited to talk about design for R today, and got my background looking like Earth Day.
Pretty good.
Thank you. Samantha, over to you.
I'm digging the background. That's so cool. You'll teach me the trick. So I'm Samantha. After a brief stint as a social entrepreneur supporting NASA, I was volunteering with Engineers Without Borders, NASA Johnson Space Center with my co-founder, Matthew, for those that were on the previous panel might recognize. And we started Re3D. We're a social enterprise. It's a bootstrapped open source hardware company in Austin, Houston, and San Juan, Puerto Rico that makes toilet-sized 3D printers that now go as big as a shipping container to enable low-cost, on-demand manufacturing. And thanks to the community's support, through some grants and pitch competitions, we've been able to modify our portfolio of large-scale printers to be able to print from pellets or regrind. So now we can print with trash or non-trash, either in filament form, pellet form, or shredded garbage form.
Awesome.
Thanks so much for joining us. And Patrick.
Hey everyone, I'm Patrick Melton. I'm a manufacturing manager at Dragon. Mechanical engineer by trade, and I worked in the medical device industry for the first few years of my career, and then I transitioned over to manufacturing. And at Dragon, I've really been focused on sustainability and how we can work with our network of contract manufacturers to get some insight into the sustainability of their manufacturing processes.
Great. Well, thank you all again for joining us today, and for those of you listening in. So I believe our poll, thank you, Andrew. So you should be able to see the results of the poll on the screen. Good thing this looks somewhat similar to the poll with the questions, same questions, so it's good the responses are somewhat similar to what we've seen earlier today. We do have a large number of folks who want to incorporate sustainable design practices into their current or upcoming hardware projects. We also have some folks here who are just listening in for general knowledge, and I thank you all for being here. Hopefully you will fulfill that goal today. In terms of roles at the company, it's also really encouraging to see that quite a large percentage of you do have some influence on your company's decisions and choices that you get to make about sustainable practices. I'd love to use that as a bit of a segue, and Dave, I'm gonna kick things off to you first. We talked a little bit about this concept of choice. Mm-hmm. And this is something, Dave, you had mentioned to me on an earlier conversation. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what is the importance of choice for developers, designers, product owners, and startups, as well as larger companies, as it relates to designing for sustainable practices.
Yeah, I think whenever we're thinking about designing for sustainability, what's difficult is it's usually not the core product feature or functionality when you set out to build something. And so when we talk about this idea of choice, our belief from Fictive's standpoint is that you want to help expand the portfolio of choices or solutions that engineers have to build a product in the earliest stages. There's been a lot of studies on this, but actually the first initial concept design you build of whatever product usually only accounts for about 4% of that product cost. But actually it accounts for almost 70% of the entire life cycle cost of that product. So said like in more simplistic terms, the decisions you make on day one of how this product will kind of be constructed is going to influence the life cycle completely. So if an engineer doesn't have a lot of choice and they know that they only have one manufacturer that does injection molding and they only know about PC ABS, well, they're probably just going to go to a PC ABS plastic product, and that's what the solution is going to be. But I think in the beginning, if you give a lot of choice to a design engineer, where is it made? What materials can I use? What processes do we actually look at? You can end up building in sustainability from day one. And so I know that there's a lot of folks, Ryan's responsible for this, Samantha helps on the back end as well, but I think this idea of choice is so important in the early stages of product development for sustainability.
I think it's also a good time. Yeah, I think that's also a good time in your startup life cycle as a company to have those philosophical discussions of where do we want to prioritize, where we want to focus. A question that I get a lot, and I'm sure we'll get on the panel is, well, how can I make this cost neutral, or how do I justify the costs of it? And fundamentally, if you're a startup, you have something new. You have something new that you're bringing out into the world. You have an opportunity to price that and value that at whatever the value is to your company. You have something exclusive, and the way that you bring that forward should speak to why you want to bring that forward to the customers that want to monetize that. And if there's customers that won't pay for that extra thing, they probably don't value the fundamental feature and product and value that you're bringing out there. So, I think startups have a really unique opportunity, whereas corporations kind of get stuck in this, CSR, corporate social responsibility. Let me put a spreadsheet together and see where I can trade off between departments. Startups have a blue sky, right? You have a greenfield option where you can really have those philosophical discussions early in a line.
Thanks. And Samantha, can you talk a little bit too about how you see making those early, at Dragon, we're big fans of saying early decisions cast long shadows. If you're familiar with Dragon, you've probably heard us say this before. But how those choices early on come into play in the world that you live and work in.
Sure. Yeah. So What's interesting about additive manufacturing is you have the potential to really reduce maybe the amount of waste than you would have, say, with a fabrication process like subtractive manufacturing, where you're actually carving out what it is that you want. So you have the ability to think about how you create an object that only uses a certain amount of input, and 100% of it could be, if you design it right, you can minimize, support an excess waste. So it's included in the object that you would consume, and then you can control maybe how hollow or solid it is to really limit the amount of raw material that it's actually needed for your product. And thinking a little bit beyond that, though, there's a lot of conversations sometimes as you're talking about in terms of like pricing and cost. And what we found in our research with Gigabyte X, our printer that can take regrind, is I think originally had in mind post-consumer waste, like the straws in your glove box or the water bottles that you might see in a disaster response scenario that accumulate, or even the plastic bags that we all have in our cupboards. But what we found from the early sales of that beta product is the appetite has actually been major research labs as well as big manufacturing brands, because unfortunately there's just so much what we call trim and scrap that's produced in manufacturing processes. That's part of the traditional ways that they fabricate. And I could go on for hours, as we have in our previous conversations, with just firsthand observations we've had in meetings at some of these corporations, where we watch literally rooms fill up with garbage over a couple hours in a tour, and then it's getting trucked off. And I see this, the greatest extreme of this is in Puerto Rico, where there's a lot of manufacturing, and you'll just watch trucks coming in and out down the road all day long, shoveling away that post-manufacturing waste in an island where the landfills are at capacity, or they'll all be closed in 1 to 2 years. So the real benefit there, especially like in an island scenario when you have a longer supply chain anyways, is to take the waste that you're already making in manufacturing, and as you think about that product design and upside, thinking about how that could be used potentially with, say, additive manufacturing or another process to complement that product line. So one example that comes up over and over again, in fact, we met with 2 manufacturers yesterday who listed the same interest, is to make plastic pallets. So with concerns over, the toll that the lumber can take and deforestation, there's a lot of interest now in going away from wooden pallets that a lot of your goods are shipped on, and transitioning to plastic pallets. And then to take that one step farther, there's the potential to take the manufacturing trim you're already creating that you have to pay to dispose of or sometimes get fined for, and then to use that to create a good that you're also paying to source. And in Puerto Rico, they don't make them on the island. So there's this, conversation, and it was mentioned earlier in the panel today, around those double and triple value adds that I think are really intriguing. So we are now, with our customers, really looking at the complete operations when they're thinking about their product, and then looking at how even their waste and their product design can either be reduced or then reused to complement the products that they're already making and the processes that they have in play.
Okay, thank you. Patrick, I know, in your role as kind of a manufacturing manager, often the companies that you're talking to have already made certain design choices. Do you have any learnings to kind of share with the audience here? Is there a point at which it's too late to incorporate sustainable design choices? Or is it always, this is maybe a leading question, are there things you can do at any stage that, will improve your processes or your design?
Right, yeah. As everyone's pretty much been saying, is early decisions cast long shadows. So if you start off super early, you can incorporate sustainability into your design cycle and manufacturing processes. So yeah, it's totally an abstract problem, because we're not used to thinking this way. So I guess a good case study that I've found is Xerox, who actually established a remanufacturing plant in Australia. That was, I think it was in the early 2000s. And what they did was they switched up their business model to from sales into leasing and serviceability. So they would collect those machines before they were sent to recycling and waste. And then they would bring them to this remanufacturing plant, and they ended up being able to reuse 70 to 90% of the components that were in those used machines. So what they did was they collected those machines before they were sent to waste. They inspected and tested those incoming used machines to figure out what was wrong with them. And then they also, during remanufacturing, they were also able to include product upgrades onto the next generation of the product. And then they would test them again to validate to as new conditions. So in the long term, or to answer your question, I don't really think ideally you can make the choice early on to become sustainable, but you can also incorporate it into your current products, even into the next generation of your product.
I think I agree, Patrick. Like, one of the biggest things that needs to happen is sustainability needs to be a line item on your decision matrix. Like, that's probably the single biggest thing that will influence. We always talk about speed, quality, price, like that core triangle in product development. But if you don't have the discussion, I think what Ryan was saying of, is sustainability something that's on my product requirement doc? Like on my PRD, does it say that I'm going to manage the yield coming off the manufacturing line? Am I going to manage what the cradle to cradle approach of this product is? And so what happens is, one of the biggest wastes in product development ends up being packaging, like how the product is shipped. And the reason why is it's not your core product. You make this thing, you make an air purifier, Ryan can talk about this, and you're like, oh crap, it needs to ship somewhere. Oh, and it can't break when it ships. And then so you throw all this thing together just to ensure quality, right? That's what you're doing. That's that decision matrix. And then you end up with all this waste. So I think the single biggest thing, and Ryan, hopefully you can share from in the trenches, is like, you got to have that line item on there that just says sustainability.
Yeah, and I think it's important to, again, have those discussions early to understand, we're talking very generally about sustainability. There's 5, 10, 50, if we listed them, sometimes orthogonal parameters to sustainability, right? And so having an understanding of, is sustainability target company energy consumption? Is sustainability, workforce lifestyle improvements? Is sustainability air quality? Is sustainability material usage and recycling, right? And it comes down to the core mission of your company. Molecule is a great example where clearly for us, clean air was the mission, right? We're out there to get clean air in the world. So that was one of the things, knowing that, being the person on the ground in China, it gave me the confidence to say, hey, in my role of VP manufacturing, there's always going to be 10 fires, right? So I can't put all of them out. Where do I focus? What do I focus on? How do I get my partner to align on that focus, right? And I think that's a question that comes up a lot is, well, this is going to be, against their normal business, or, they're not going to want this. And I think that it's about asking those open-ended questions, right? What are your waste material streams? Where do they currently go? And making those questions very much about showing that you're there to collaborate together and want to improve the whole supply chain, right? Because you don't want to be coming in a manufacturer and the sense like, where's the waste? What's how do we cut this out? It's, hey, where is it? Because I might actually be able to reuse it. I could actually save you money that you don't need to dump this waste and you get to use it in my product and I'm even happier, right? And so those are hard conversations to have. You sometimes need to get, one level up in management to really get aligned. And it's just about, one, having the relationship you can even have those conversations, but two, asking them in a very friendly and collaborative way. And that, hey, we're trying to get creative here. You have the expertise. You know this better than us. We're not trying to fundamentally change your processes. We're just trying to understand where the material, information, energy flow in your process is so that we can potentially re-optimize it to what we need out of our process and what our customers really want from our product.
Yep. Spot on.
I think you make
a good point
about mentioning you need multiple stakeholders too. As we've started, as a startup, to engage with some of the bigger brands in this conversation, one of the best tactics for us, just to have good dialogue and to get informed on where the need is to be invited to a lunch and learn at a pharmaceutical company, or part of an innovation conversation focused on sustainability that has maybe people at the line level in manufacturing, even perhaps the janitor, the person managing or operating the plant at different levels, someone on the innovation team, and then an executive. It's been really interesting to see just, in presenting like sustainability as a theme and all these considerations, starting to think about that operations perspective, seeing where their conversations go, and then, helping point them to our peers in the community that can help satisfy that. Because everyone's seeing it from a different angle, and then getting to that point where you put metrics around it, I think is really key. And sometimes it's hard on the qualitative stuff. So you really have to drill down and brainstorm together.
Which is why I think it's so important that if you say sustainability, or, we're talking about design for R in this case. So it's like, if design for R is a requirement for your product, actually, I think you'd be amazed that if the top sets it, like if the founder or the CEO sets that initiative, it's actually, the CEO doesn't know how to change that at all. They don't have visibility. But if you have full company visibility, it's actually the person that's doing the work on the ground, they're going to have the best ideas. One of the ways that we push this at Fictive, because obviously we're responsible for making so many products across many different companies, is that last Christmas, we gave Cradle to Cradle, the book, to our entire company. And we did a book club where we gave it at Christmas, we read it, and then at the end of January, we all got together to talk about it. And so this was one of the best ways I could influence the whole company to say, hey, you're now educated with common language. Just literally, that's all it is common language and how to talk about it. And then this whole initiative spurred that my sales folks can have conversations with our customers. Our logistics people are talking to FedEx about it. Our, supply quality engineers are saying, hey, where does that waste go? And so I'm such a believer in setting the priority at the highest level, and then just pushing to say, how does that seep into your product? And so if there's just one thing that I'd push, from, I think what you're saying, Samantha, is help align those metrics and goals, and let the people, figure out how it flows from there.
And Dave, could you spend, a couple of seconds talking about, you've now mentioned Cradle to Cradle, and there's a book of this with that title. I know in Scott's keynote, he talked about the linear economy basically being cradle to grave. So that might be a phrase folks are more familiar with. Can you talk a little bit, is Cradle to Cradle that circular economy that's kind of goal for future, or what, when it says Cradle to Cradle, what exactly do you mean?
Yeah, so if folks haven't read it, pick up the book, because I won't do it justice. Actually, the background here is like, this is the idea of, it's all around not just how do you take something from raw goods, so say wood, and I'm going to put it into my product, and then the wood gets recycled. It's saying, after I recycle it, what happens to that, and how does it decompose and goes back into a product itself? So I think Samantha is a really great example of, hey, I use a Ziploc bag that was made from petroleum. It came to me, I used a Ziploc bag, I put my sandwich in it. Wow, really good turkey avocado, that was delicious. Then I have that bag, it gets recycled somewhere, but can I regrind that up, print it, doing an additive method, and now I'm making pallets that carry goods as well. You're getting to see the full cycle of this. And so there's a lot of approach to, Al Gore talks about this as well, but how do you put a monetary incentive on structures so that businesses aren't just incentivized to do good for the earth, but actually that there's credits that come back? From my world, one of the best examples was, so Ford's where I came from before starting Fictive, and Bill Ford is third generation Ford. And he was the chairman at the time while I was there. And he had a huge initiative that was around sustainability. And so they actually took like all of the F-150 seats, and it was a lot of recyclability that went into the cushions inside of these. That sounds like a small initiative, but you can imagine how many seats are made in automotive every year. But it takes that level. I'm talking like third generation, your last name's on the logo, I think, to push all the way through an organization like that. And they were only cradle to grave. Like, they weren't thinking the last piece on it. But I think education is really important here. And
you mentioned something that I think is really key, and also was a recurring theme in some of the questions we received in advance, which is about business incentives behind designing for sustainable manufacturing. So Samantha, I might pass this to you to take an initial answer, but I think the impression of a lot of folks is that designing for sustainable manufacturing, whatever that means, is the right thing to do, but that it's much more expensive. And so how do you make a business case for that? Is there a business upside?
Yeah, so I think it'll be great to hear everyone's take on this, because again, there's a lot of ways to skin the cat. From a company standpoint, in terms of seeing if our product meets the need of our customers, again, we try to get as many stakeholders in the room and kind of look at, what are all the ins and outs to see maybe how some of their products could be made through AM to conserve on the raw materials that they may be importing or fabricate that go into it, as well as how, they can make a product that potentially could be easier to ship and find other ways to cut down on costs. But I think it goes much broader than that. There's also a lot of incentives now that are forming in municipalities. For example, I split my time between Austin and Puerto Rico, where there's a lot of municipal conversation right now around waste, and the state of Texas as they think about, how we become zero waste by 2040 and what motivators companies will need to accomplish that, and incentivizing startups here in Austin to help close a loop so that the waste never touches the landfill. So there are, federal and municipal incentives, as well as just, goodwill and PR that helps with, recruiting and retention. In terms of the broader conversation, though, there's definitely a lot of dialogue around packaging waste. One of the things that comes up the most in our world is saran wrap. So we've talked to, some of the biggest hardware and grocery companies in the world who are very concerned with the amount of waste that they contribute to their local geographies or landfills through like the saran wrap around pallets.
Yeah.
Alone, and it's just abhorrent, and there's really not a good use for it. So we look at reducing that, and that takes a lot of forms. But one way to overcome that, in addition to just looking at having less of a need for it, is to better optimize shipping containers. So we've talked to multiple organizations about the potential, say if they have a bunch of styrofoam cups or widgets that they're putting into a container or boxes, to actually 3D print a fixture, a non-sexy thing from their own garbage, maybe their own saran wrap or other material that they're putting a lot out of or pumping a lot out of, and using it to help create these fixtures to put more of that object in a shipping container. So there's fewer trips that they have to take back and forth to shorten their supply chain. So you can get really creative. Beyond that, I would say we could probably talk for a long time about processes, and if there's a way that you can use your technology just to shorten the time that it takes to do something, because again, that can be quantified. But beyond that, actually looking at the machinery itself that's needed and the amount of human touches. So that's where large format AM sometimes can be beneficial. And for us personally, we felt like if we were going to make a product that could help produce other products, we wanted to make sure that it didn't expire. So for us, how we decided we were going to support that as a startup was any improvement we were going to come up with on a technology we know that is rapidly changing based on user input. It would have the opportunity to be modified or upgraded with any future feature that we came up with. So your gigabot, we say, never expires. And I think, there's a lot to be said. Obviously, we tip our hats to Craftsman Tools and all those giants that have, John Deere makes, these durable tractors, have been doing this for years. But kind of going back to that mantra, my co-founder Matthew refers to it as making like the cast iron skillet, and in trying to only produce products that can just endure or be hacked as long as needed, so that they don't end up ultimately contributing to the waste conversation as well.
And Ryan, can I ask your input on this topic too? And coming back to those business incentives, you mentioned, startups are in a unique position to kind of have blue sky, green field. I really liked that, by the way. We'll go with those Earth Day themes. But some of it is also, a lot of the startups, I believe, at least in your world, need VC dollars. And there was a time where that kind of razor blades model, where there was kind of a disposable or consumable, was much more attractive to the venture community, and more likely that a company would be able to have a business model that could enable them to keep going. Does sustainability fit into that model? I'd love to hear your commentary on kind of that broader topic.
Yeah, a few thoughts on that. One point I would make in terms of incorporating sustainability into your business practices, something everyone should be doing, and this is again a whole other hour session, is QBRs, quarterly business reviews. And that's a very formal sit down, not the weekly calls, not the daily emails, but a very formal, once every 3 months, sit down. How are we doing? How are you doing? How are your suppliers doing? Evaluation, right? That should be quantitative. It should be metric based. It should be quantitative and metric based so that when you do this 3 months later, there's a delta. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've seen it, like, oh, we did the QBR. Was it good, bad, or ugly? Oh, I kind of felt good. I kind of felt bad. Was it better or worse than the last quarter? Oh, I don't know. Then why are you doing it, right? And so having sustainability, and again, I would argue you should probably have 2 or 3 line items there. One that's like worker quality of life, one that's environmental sustainability, and the other that would be kind of supply chain sustainability. Because that's another thing we haven't talked about is, you can beat the hell out of your vendors to get a cheaper price and a better material. If that means they're not going to be your vendors anymore because you burnt that bridge, or that means that they can't actually source that much of that material, that's something you need to know, and you need to have that relationship to understand. So those are some of the things I would highlight there. But otherwise, I would point startups to, it's important to align with your investors on this, right? And I think that, obviously you want founder-friendly investors, right? Investors that are going to not have horrible term sheets and weird terms on you. But part of that beyond the finance is, do they align with your vision? Do they align with what you're trying to bring to the world? And do they align with your philosophy that you should have already established before you go and ask people for millions of dollars, saying, hey, we want to bring this to the world, but we need to bring this to a world in a way that, is healthy to the environment, focusing on air, and, also ticks these boxes. And so I think having that aligned with your investors up front is important. And again, it's one of those, if you can't have that conversation with your investors, how are you going to have that conversation with your factory? How are you going to have that conversation with your employees? How are you going to have that conversation with your customers and message to the outside world that it's something that's important to you if you're not going to, hold the line and make that important to the partners that you're bringing in? Oftentimes it's compared to, like, essentially your factory, your manufacturing partner, and your investor are really your 2 biggest external partners that you're going to bring in. And so they're the ones that, unfortunately you have to have the hardest conversations with. You have to have the strongest relationships and financial ties. And I just think it's about having those conversations early and often, making sure that there's nothing, disjoint there. And also, again, making sure that you're having those updates, making sure that, when you're 3 months in and it's like, oh, great, well, we all started thinking this was the price and that we'd have, this much, fudge room in our BOM to incorporate some of these extras we want, whether that's features or sustainable practices. Now that we're actually 6 months into manufacturing, a lot of those things have disappeared. Do we want to increase the price? Do we want to do this? Those conversations can be hard to have if you didn't establish those core principles and establish them with your partners up front.
I think that, just if I can add a little on what Ryan said, I don't think that a razor blade model necessarily means that you can't have good design for R. I think that just because you're consuming something doesn't mean that your product can't be full cradle to grave or cradle to cradle. I mean, one of the biggest examples we all know would be Keurig, right? That, like, we use pods, but actually it's like, you can't blame Keurig, I think, for all the waste. And then as they come back and say, actually, we're going to go make recyclable versions, or we're going to make a reusable one where you use your own coffee, that I think that it, I don't want to continue to sound like a broken record, but it really comes down to what's the priority for the product. And so I don't think that a business model dictates poor sustainability necessarily. We obviously could argue at length of, is an electric car better than a diesel or gas powered, or these things, but I really do think it comes down to the founders. It comes down to what is your core initiatives and how are you going to design that in from the beginning. And I promise you, Ryan can talk about this, Patrick can talk about this, we do a lot of work in the NPI stage. Those decisions you make at concept is like, founders almost never understand that long shadow that Dragon talks about. Like, I can't overstress that enough. Of your initial concepts, it's going to be pretty hard to break that within the org, but I wouldn't blame business models necessarily.
But I think it's important also to evaluate those business models up front and address how your business models either align or don't align with what investors are seeing in trends right now, right? Like, one of the biggest ones I would point to is rental scooters, right? Like, rental scooters have been one of the biggest hardware booms of the last year. I'm of the thought that, like, why don't we make a good $1,000 scooter for someone that wants to commute? Whereas the business model that investors liked was, let's make a bunch of $300 scooters, dump them on the street, see if people rent them. If they do rent them, we have monthly recurring revenue to prove revenue, and we'll keep renting them. Guess what? Nobody's rented a scooter in 2 months. Like, that is completely orthogonal to, the current social trends, because, investors were addicted to recurring revenue, like monthly or annual recurring revenue, right? So That's one of those areas where I think knowing up front, these are the parts of our business that will scale, these are the parts of our business that won't scale, and these are things that investors like and don't like. They're addicted to revenue, and that's fair because their job is to create revenue for their LPs. Like that's something, I think people kind of dodge around. But fundamentally, there are fundamentals to your business model that you can't change once you're so far in. I
will pour one out for Boosted Board that did make that $2,000 electric scooter that is no more, unfortunately. But I hear you, Ryan.
Yeah, no, we've had Inboard go down in the meantime because they didn't go with the subscription model. I think it's been hard. I'm not saying for people to force it to that model. I'm saying, did no one go to China 5 years ago and see bikes dumped everywhere? Like, have we not seen the end of the subscription rental model?
Well, we knew how the story went.
So I think, that's one thing to poke on, and I poke on that a lot. But I think that it's representative of the trends that investors are focused in, and the trends that you need to speak to if you're speaking to those investors.
I want to switch gears kind of, and Patrick, kick things back to you for a second. So, we've lumped together design for R. And I think one of the things I'd love to poke a little bit or dig a bit further into is there a difference in terms of if you're designing for kind of cradle to cradle or cradle to grave? I mean, and to that end, is there a difference in if you are designing for end of life? So are there nuances? How does one structure a mental framework thinking about I'm designing for repair versus designing for recycle versus designing for reuse?
Yeah, so I think recycling takes on multiple meanings for a lot of different people. People think that it means reusing or repairing, but really recycling means that the product has reached the end of its life cycle, and when you recycle it, it becomes a new material. So in a sense, recycling should be a last resort if we're going to transition to a low or no waste economy. And if you take a look at that even further, especially with plastics, as Scott was saying in his keynote, only 9% are recycled. And that's based on residential recycling collection rates. So even less of that 9% is actually made into new materials. So I think the best way to get those materials back into the production stream is to reuse them and set up a process to send them back to the factories to get them repaired and remanufactured. And just some design things for that is to use identical housing plastic enclosures for the next generation of your product, and making sure that it's easily disassemblable so that when the recyclers get that product, they know what material it is and how to recycle it. I think if you can label the materials on your design, then that'll make sure that they can easily know what material it is when they recycle it.
Yeah.
And Samantha, you talked about this a little bit, I mean, in terms of kind of the hyper-locality or what you're seeing in Puerto Rico, but do you have, I think to Patrick's point, is there sort of low-hanging fruit? Or, how much of a hill do we have to climb in order to be able to incorporate some of these practices?
Yeah, so we like to say within the company and in these conversations, because we're new to this ourselves and came into it from the angle of new job creation and economic empowerment and less about the green angle. So, and we're not material scientists, but what we like to say is, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? So I think we can all agree, starting today on Earth Day, every day we can just try to be a little bit better. Every quarter in our review with our company, and we can work on, improving that delta between, maybe where we want to go or where we really fell short in the past. In terms of just like little things. So as we have made this bot that can now slowly start to print with different types of waste, and we're starting to get research dollars around better characterization and the economics of that. We started baking, for those of you that may have crossed paths with us at CES or 3D Experience or some of the other live events before the pandemic hit, we were making these chairs that were made from 100% water bottles as just like a first use case of something functional you would make from trash. And it was relatable globally. And that was paired with wood that was actually provided to us by the Habitat for Humanity Restore in Austin, Texas. And so the first generation of the chair that we took to CES had, and for those of you that are smarter than us might chuckle, but these plastic sides made from water bottles with this wood, and it was hammered in and glued. It was epoxied. And we went to reuse it, and as you know, we've been doing these life cycle analysis and reading some of these books, we were like, shucks, you know, if we were had more foresight, perhaps we would have used screws, because then the whole thing can be disassembled, say if someone is really inebriated at a conference and finds a way to break it. So we could easily repurpose it. And so the next version that we took to Tennessee then with SolidWorks and 3D Experience had, you know, this screw version in it. And with all the products that we've started to make as these beta products from the printer, we recognize, you know, we have an inherent responsibility too to ensure that, you know, if unfortunately, if it can't be repaired, that it can be reused and repurposed into something else. So, you know, we're thinking a lot about glues and our processes and what could get paired with prints and recommendations for our customers is that first step. And, you know, we could definitely get much more sophisticated, but I think it's really important that we all start to develop that awareness around the ability to, particularly in AM, if we're going to be printing with trash, we really want to ensure that whatever is made can be ground up and then remade if it's not usable as the current product, or if it no longer has relevance.
Ryan, quick question maybe to pass your way. I'd love to hear a little bit about, and this is not just for you, but what are kind of the low-hanging fruit? And Samantha, you just mentioned glue. So I'd be very curious, what are the things that everyone should be doing or that no one should be doing? So, I mean, is glue a really terrible worse offender? And by the way, not just materials related, but are there things that we think about, and Ryan, I know you have some knowledge in this space, that seem sustainable on the surface, but potentially because of high energy use or otherwise, you know, really are not and should not be best practices?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I think that getting all the information you can, right? And that's very open-ended, but, you know, we've had questions about how do I get this information? Where do I get it? How do I prioritize it? An example that I would use is when we were at Molecule trying to start to quantify this, one of the big things was obviously shipping, right? Like if we're air shipping versus sea shipping, all these things, how do we compare it? And so it's something, you know, we started to ask Flexport, our freight forwarder, you know, how do you guys quantify this, right? Now Flexport at the time was, you know, Series C, hundreds of people, very large. About 3 months after that, they started putting out CO2 outputs. Now, I don't think at all that that's because I was asking them and they had an internal ticket that said, hey, Ryan's asking, let's go do this. I think that they're a smart company that was already evaluating a part of their business. But by asking those questions early, I clearly got on a list of like, hey, Ryan wants to know this. So when we have the CO2 emissions, let's let Molecule know first, right? And you know, that's clear because there are partners like that. That's like, it's core to their business. They should know that. You should be able to ask it and get it out of them. But starting to kind of ask that about every part of your supply chain and put in assumptions if you don't have it. If you don't have it, put in extreme assumptions that force you to go get it, right? Put in a dollar amount that says, well, this is $100 on my BOM until I know it's not, right? And having those forcing functions. And just thinking about, you know, where along the chain is that going to hit? Where, you know, because something that I think is more considered is the internal and then maybe to customer logistics of, hey, I need to ship this to a warehouse and I need to ship it to the customer. What's the impact of that? But thinking about the full life cycle assessment, how is the customer using it? If that customer is taking this product on an airplane 1,000 times in their use cycle, does that change the amount of jet fuel used? I mean, little things like this where there's a trickle down effect, even if you can't quantify all that, starting to make assumptions to get it in there. A study that I point people to often because I think it was different than a lot of us expected was there was a study about 5 years ago that was analyzing the video game industry, trying to see if we have a physical disc, if we print a Blu-ray disc, put packaging around it, all those horrible things we just talked about, and ship it to a customer versus digital download. This should be better. We're just downloading it at our house. All we're doing is server costs. I would equate this to a hardware company, an IoT company with their AWS server costs. Guess what? Digital download was actually a larger carbon footprint impact than shipping a physical Blu-ray disc.
No way.
Now, that was rather shocking to people. it was 50% more impact. Now that was 5 years ago. Things have changed. They put some parameters in that, but I would say one, go and analyze what's actually doing. Look at every bit of it. AWS isn't just a server cost. It's a, why are they pulling that? If they're pulling data, how much energy is that using? All these little things that can be considered. Very similar, the other one I would put, and again, this is one of those 5 years ago studies evolved a lot, is the analysis of electric vehicles, where, people did analysis to say, well, hey, right now in 2013, because there's so much coal in the electric grid, charging an electric vehicle isn't actually that much cleaner than just getting a diesel or gasoline car. Well, guess what? Things that missed was the assumption that the grid gets cleaner every single year. Every single time you plug that electric vehicle in, there's a higher mix of solar, a higher mix of wind, a higher mix of renewable energy into that, to the point where you are cleaning, your car is using less, more efficient energy each time, right? Or compared to a particulate car, a conventional ICE, internal combustion engine, which that supply chain gets dirtier, gets less efficient, gets more contaminated every single time you use it, right? And so thinking about A, how do I analyze my whole supply chain, server, digital, all these costs, and then B, how do I think about the long-term trends of that? Is the electric grid going to stay the same? Are Amazon servers going to stay the same in power usage and distribution and all those things? And how do I start to get assumptions for that now, and then quantify that deeper and deeper as I knock those assumptions off?
Thank you. I'd love to ask a couple more questions here, but I want to make sure we transition to taking questions from the audience. Right now, I see there are 2 in the Q&A, but if anyone else has additional questions, please feel free to put them in that Q&A section. From a logistics standpoint, if we're not able to answer all of the questions, if you have follow-ups, we should be able to reach out individually to answer some of those. From that standpoint, I think the first question we have here, Samantha, I believe this is directed towards you and Re3D. How do you know what waste resources are available and the quality of that waste in the substrates or materials that you're using?
Yeah, I mean, the honest answer is a lot of times we don't. And that's where sometimes working with the bigger brands is really helpful. So for example, we have learned just by working with waste aggregators or collectors in different communities around the world, there's a lot of interest around using water bottles. But what we found even from our own studies through the National Science Foundation is different vendors of water bottles just have, whatever glycol or additive in it that makes the printability slightly different. So we're really beholden to actually getting that chemical formulation from the manufacturer of the water bottles. And sometimes, in that instance, the companies may be very open or they may not. We're actually still looking for the formulation for that specifically. So we end up spending a lot of time trying to garner, some insight into what's in there and how it can be mixed, what type of adhesive they use for the label, the colorant on the label and the plastic around it, and then the cap. And that can take a lot of time. And that's just one example. So, sometimes manufacturers have a really well characterized supply chain and a lot of control and visibility into it. I'm amazed at how many manufacturers, however, we talk to in big brands that want to engage in this conversation, and they're still commissioning consultants to do 1 or 2 year studies, and they don't even know how much they're holding across their entire supply chain or in all the warehouses that they have globally. So that is, that level of information is step one. There are things you can do on the science end and the maker end and the cowboy end like us to try and figure it out and to cope with it. One way that we sometimes get around that is, looking at, and the Dutch have done a great job at this in this conversation, at extruding with, say, a bigger nozzle size, so you can contend with some of those contaminants, and thinking through objects you can make that are relevant, where maybe resolution isn't as important. And then looking at early use cases like palettes can be really helpful, because no one really cares if they're beautiful. So they can have a couple of occlusions or missteps, or maybe those non-sexy, container optimizers, while we really understand waste and how to print with it, and can turn it into something that maybe is more aesthetic. But it's definitely a long play. We hope a lot of people enter this conversation and we kind of have a mafia called Trash Printers United for those of us that are charging this bill, and for anyone that's into 3D printing and garbage, we'd love to include you into that fold so that, you know, hopefully there's a lot of collaboration, and there's definitely more research needed on the academic side of it. You know, we talk a lot about the responsibility of corporations, but and I would love to get a PhD in the US on, you know, 3D printing from garbage. That's not a thing. There's very few sustainability programs. So until we're really putting dollars into research in that ecosystem to ensure those failures are captured, and not just those singular wins, and we have these libraries of information, it is very difficult.
Thank you. Dave, I might pass this one to you. We've got a question from James Myers. Can you comment on design for R for a more complex Technosphere product like a smartphone, whether hypothetically or actually? Basically, isn't the best option here more of a service model, thereby incentivizing the designer to be able to repair, reuse, and recycle what is otherwise a very complex multi-material object? And kind of what other ways or paths do you see forward?
For sure. So I'll answer it from my perspective, and then James maybe point you to a few other resources as well. This entire practice, you know, in the product design world, we call it DFX. And so design for X and can stand for assembly, manufacturability. And in this case, the one that's easiest to research is called serviceability. So there's a lot of studies that are done if you want to look up design for serviceability. And this is the idea of how serviceable is a product. Probably one of the most public examples of this is iFixit. Puts out a score of how serviceable a product is. Now they mostly focus on consumer goods versus, you know, how serviceable is a car. But I think that the serviceability score is really important. You can see this in a lot of products. You know, an iPhone is not serviceable. Like, I mean, you can, but the serviceability score is pretty low. It's definitely gotten better over the years. If you think about the first gen iPhones versus today. Automotive is a great example as well. If you open the hood of your 2020 Mustang versus if you open the hood of a 1969 Shelby GT500 Mustang, her name's Eleanor. You know, you can totally tune that entire engine and you can service it really well. But the 2020 Mustang is plastics and everything ties into the computer. So this goes back to what we were saying from the very beginning of the decisions you make at the concept phase are going to dictate this thing for years. And so for a car, we have to design for 10 years there. And so I think that I'm 100% with you that you need to incentivize the designer in the NPI phase to make serviceability something that's important for them. And I think what's amazing about engineers, and Ryan's pointed to this, is we can solve any problem. You know, if you say serviceability is number one, I'm going to make a product that you can break apart. And like Samantha was saying, it's going to have screws, not glue. And so my cost will go up because my DFA, my design for assembly, is going to have more manual time, cycle time on the tack time on the assembly line. But you're going to be able to have serviceability. And so your cost to assemble might be higher, but actually the cost to service it could be lower. Your RMAs are less, people can do at-home serviceabilities. So I think it's really what Ryan's talked a lot about too, of this idea of don't just look at what you think the immediate impact is. You know, if it's the download a game, of course that's cheaper. Now I want you to look at the whole life cycle over 10 years, like a car on a grid. So hopefully that's helpful, and happy to follow up afterwards as well. Thanks for the question though, James.
That was a great Gone in 60 Seconds reference. I was hopeful we were going to get Fast and Furious in there somehow today.
Oh, sorry. I can't. Yeah. Too many versions.
Quite all right. Let's take one more. So Emily Porter has asked, you know, we heard some success stories on the panel today, Xerox, Re3D, about actually making that final closure of the circular manufacturing loop. What new types of systems or infrastructure do we think that we need to continue to make these types of stories a success? And specifically, Emily is asking, how can we as designers and engineers better access and understand those systems? So Patrick, I might kick this to you for your take on the answer.
Yeah, so I think in general, when you're designing for sustainability and just new types of infrastructure, you're kind of designing for new types of user groups. So you have obviously your end consumers, your investors, but you're also designing for the people who are disassembling your product if you're going to have it remanufactured. You're designing for the people who are going to remanufacture and retest your product. You're designing for the people who are going to reassemble it and upgrade it for the next product version. So, and you're also designing for people who are going to recycle it. So I think it's important to consider those types of considerations for designing for remanufacturing and new types of infrastructure.
I think I'll give a little bit of a self-promotional plug too. We believe in choice at Fictive. Like, I think that's the biggest thing. If you go to a manufacturer and all that they have is this type of injection molding and they're good at doing white ABS, your product's going to be in white ABS. And if that's your only choice, that's what you're going to produce. One of the benefits of, you know, what we think we provide at Fictive is because I don't own any machines, it's the ultimate choice. So here's like the smorgasbord. What do you want? You know, is a little bit higher cost, like you're saying, Patrick, tenable for your product. Okay, well, we can make it here to have better serviceability or better lifetime. And so I think we really believe in trying to help designers and engineers like yourself say, what's important to you? Do you want to make domestically, overseas, plastics, metal, additive, subtractive, molded, cured, to really do this? And so I just would continue to push more technology to give engineers choice. That's like the general answer. And if there's specific things, I think Dragon can help. You know, I know the Fictive team could help as well. Actually, I'm sure this whole panel could. You go to Ryan to design it, Samantha to help build it, Dragon to help give the entire plans and how you're going to make it, and then we'll help stitch it all together. So,
in terms of the comment about, you know, stories and where do you look, obviously this is my soapbox. So I think a lot about this, and selfishly it benefits me, but I think we really need to go beyond just like Facebook shares and live demos that are really cool and the sexy things that generate good dialogue, and really, again, ensuring that there's rigor and thought put into this conversation in terms of reuse examples that's in an open and accessible format, and really continuing to try and stimulate and support the academics that are entering this conversation. So that, you know, it's not biased to, you know, a Re3D or a Fictive or any other company or organization, but you know, holistic and as objective as possible, and not just, you know, something again that's shared actively through social media, because I think some of the best examples are kind of like living in that, and sometimes as makers too, we're guilty of doing that and making sure that, you know, it really gets criticized and is studied from multiple angles by the academic environment as well.
Thank you. All right, to wrap things up, we're going to do a rapid fire around the panel. And not to put anyone on the spot, what current product do you admire, whether you own it or not? And Ryan, no fair picking digital downloads or Blu-ray discs, that, you know, you think embodies sort of exceptional design for R? Dave.
Cool, I'll go. Mine might be cheating a little bit, but I love egg cartons. And the reason I love egg cartons is, think about how this thing's designed to protect something incredibly fragile. The reusability of it is like, I just planted my garden out back, and I use an egg carton to help start all the seeds inside of it. It then can be compostable at the end, which has helped growing those actual plants. Like, it's actually in our compost outside. And so I love the example of, you know, I could have said a Tesla or, you know, something sexy, but something as simple as an egg carton that you use every day, the amount of thought that goes into that product and design to get it to the place where it is, it's actually phenomenal. So egg carton is what I'll go with.
That's a great answer.
I'll go next. I'll pick one a little bit more complicated. One I'm a big fan of is Keyboardio. It's keyboard.io. It's a former Highway 1 startup. Very simple in the product. It's a keyboard, right? It's an ergonomic keyboard. Computer programmer didn't like the ergonomic keyboards out there, want to make a better one. What's really cool about it is the whole approach is it is made to be hacked. It is made to be edited. They literally ship it with source code and a screwdriver. right? Like it's literally designed to like flip the thing open, pull it out. You want your own enclosure? Great. Get rid of the wood, 3D print it, put the board in, it'll work, right? And so because they came from the software world, you know, having that open source mentality, which is again a whole other hour we could talk about, having that open source, open fixability, I think really, really puts Keyboardio apart and drove a lot of design.
Great. Patrick.
I would say, this isn't in consumer electronics, but I would say anything by Patagonia. I think they have this awesome trade-in program where you can just send in any used item that you have, and they'll take it and reuse everything and make something new. And they also have a marketplace where you can just buy people's used clothing, but they refurbish it. So I admire the way that they're going about sustainability. So that's my answer.
Great. And Samantha.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the simple examples as well. I'm at that age where I've had a lot of friends and siblings get married, and I think the paper with the seeds in it, I've never you know, read a study on it to see how great it really is for the environment, but I love the idea of taking stationery and then using it to grow something afterwards. And then beyond that, Re3D has always kind of closely followed the brewing industry because we see a lot of similarities to the additive manufacturing community and the maker community. And I think the inroads that some brewers are making now and thinking about sustainability and particularly taking their own waste to then maybe make a 6-pack ring is really cool. And so we're big fans of that.
I love all of it. Thank you all so much. So everyone, wherever you are in your home, give our panel a virtual or actual round of applause. The 4 of you, thank you so much for joining us today. For those of you attendees, whether you just stayed with us for this panel or heard all of the events during today's virtual summit, really appreciate your attendance, your attention, and your wonderful questions. If we weren't able to address your question, please shoot them our way. We will have these recordings available on demand afterwards. If you needed to, we talked pretty quickly, if you need to go back and hear it again. Thank you to everybody. Stay safe. Have a wonderful rest of your Earth Day, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much, Dragon. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.